The silence in my house used to be a comfort, a soft blanket I could pull over myself after a long day. It was the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the gentle tick of the grandfather clock in the hall that my late husband, Robert, had cherished, the sigh of the old floorboards settling. It was a peaceful silence, one filled with the ghosts of happy memories. Now, the silence is different. It's a monument, a cavernous, echoing thing that bears witness to a choice I was forced to make. On the mantelpiece, propped against a small, silver-framed photograph of Robert and me on our own wedding day, sits an invitation. It's thick, cream-colored cardstock, with embossed gold lettering announcing the union of my only daughter, Clara, to Julian Montgomery. The wedding was supposed to be yesterday. I have no idea if it happened. I only know that I was not there. My tea has long since gone cold on the coaster beside me, its surface gone placid and dark, a mirror for the stillness in my heart. I've been sitting in this armchair, Robert's armchair, for hours, replaying the last few months in my mind, turning over the events like a string of rosary beads, each one a prayer I didn't know I was making. A prayer for a different outcome. I always thought I understood the nature of love, the unconditional, self-sacrificing core of what it meant to be a mother. I believed it was a fortress, an unbreakable bond forged in sleepless nights and fevers, in scraped knees and first heartbreaks, in pride at graduations and solace in failures. For Clara, my love was a vast, open territory with no borders, no tariffs, no questions asked. I see now how naive that was. Love, I've learned, can be weaponized. Generosity can be twisted into expectation, and duty can become a yoke. For years, I was the reliable, steadfast son in Clara's orbit, and I was happy to be. But I never realized that to her, and to the man she chose to marry, I was not a son to be cherished for its warmth, but a resource to be mined until it was cold and dark. The journey to this cold, quiet room was not a sudden plunge but a slow, methodical descent, so gradual that I barely noticed the changing pressure until my ears were screaming and my lungs were ready to burst. It started, as most things do, with love, or what I mistook for it. My life with Robert was not one of extravagance, but it was rich in every way that mattered. He was a master carpenter, a man whose hands could coax poetry from wood, and I was a bookkeeper for a local firm, a woman who found comfort in the clean, predictable logic of numbers. We were a perfect balance. He built our home, literally, from the ground up on a plot of land we bought with our meager savings, and I managed the finances with a fierce precision that ensured we never wanted for anything essential. We didn't take lavish holidays or drive fancy cars, but our pantry was always full, our home was filled with warmth and laughter, and we had a savings plan that grew with the same steady, reliable pace as the oak tree Robert planted in the front yard the day Clara was born. We poured everything into that girl. She was our miracle, the bright, beautiful center of our world. We wanted her to have the opportunities we never did, the best schools, the lessons in piano and ballet she tired of after a few months, the university education that we paid for outright so she could graduate without the burden of debt. I remember the solemn promise I made to Robert in the sterile, hushed quiet of the hospital room in his final days. His hand, once so strong and capable, was frail in mine. "Helen," he'd whispered, his voice a dry rasp, "take care of our girl. Give her everything we dreamed of. Don't let her struggle like we did." I squeezed his hand, my tears falling onto our joined fingers. "I promise, Robert." Always, it was a promise I intended to keep with every fiber of my being. After he was gone, the house felt enormous and empty, but I filled the void with purpose. I continued to manage our investments, the portfolio we had built with decades of careful saving. I lived modestly, my needs were simple. My widow's pension and my own small savings were more than enough for me. The bulk of our life savings, the fruit of Robert's calloused hands and my meticulous ledgers, was earmarked for Clara. I saw it as Robert's final gift to her. In a separate account, clearly labeled in my financial planner's records, was the wedding fund. Over the years, through careful investment and additional contributions, it had grown to a substantial sum, $200,000. In my mind, it was a magical figure, a number that could conjure the perfect day, a fairy tale beginning for my daughter's own life of happiness. I pictured a lovely church, a beautiful dress, a celebration with friends and family, and I imagined Robert looking down, smiling, proud that we had kept our promise. I saw the fund as a tool to provide her with a joyful, stress-free start to her marriage. I never imagined it would become the price tag for my own dignity. Clara met Julian 2 years ago. She brought him home for Sunday dinner, and my first impression was one of polished, effortless charm. He was handsome in that expensive, well-maintained way, with a perfect smile and a firm handshake. He came from a family of wealth, not the quiet, understated kind Robert and I had respected, but a louder, more modern version. His father was in finance, a corporate raider or something equally rapacious, and his mother sat on the boards of charities that seemed to exist primarily to host galas. Julian talked about brands I'd never heard of and holidays in places I'd only seen in magazines. He looked around my comfortable, slightly worn living room with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, a kind of amused anthropological curiosity. He complimented Robert's hand-built cabinetry, but called it charming and rustic, words that felt like faint, damning praise. I tried to ignore the subtle sense of unease that settled in my stomach. Clara was besotted. She hung on his every word, her eyes shining. And I saw, almost immediately, a change in her. My daughter, who had once been content with our simple life, began to speak a new language, the language of status and acquisition. Suddenly, the home-cooked meals she'd always loved were replaced by requests for dinners at trendy, expensive restaurants. My thoughtful, practical birthday gifts, a subscription to her favorite literary journal, a high-quality gardening set for her apartment balcony, were received with a polite, but hollow, thank you. They were quickly replaced by the cashmere sweaters and designer handbags Julian would buy her. A few months into their relationship, the first real crack appeared. Julian had come to pick Clara up and I walked them out to the driveway. He looked at my 10-year-old, impeccably maintained sedan, and chuckled. "Clara, darling," he said, loud enough for me to hear clearly, "we really must get your mother a more suitable vehicle. People might think we are letting her drive a museum piece." He framed it as a joke, but the barb was sharp and clear. My car, which Robert had bought for me and which I kept in pristine condition, was a source of embarrassment. I saw Clara's cheeks flush. She didn't defend me. She didn't defend her father's memory. She just gave a tight little laugh and said, "Oh, Julian, don't be silly. Mum doesn't care about cars." Her words were meant to smooth things over, but they landed like a confirmation. My world, my values, my possessions, were beneath their consideration. I was the relic, the museum piece, not just the car. I went back inside that evening and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. I told myself I was being overly sensitive, that it was just a different generation, a different way of communicating. I was trying to understand his world, trying to bridge the gap for Clara's sake. I had no idea then that they had no interest in building a bridge. They expected me to leap across the chasm on my own. The engagement announcement came during a dinner at a restaurant so exclusive I had to look up how to pronounce its name. Julian made a grand speech, presenting Clara with a diamond ring that was so large it looked garish, a glittering weight on her slender finger. Of course, I was happy for her. Through the swirling anxiety in my chest, a genuine flicker of maternal joy asserted itself. This was it. This was the moment I had been planning for, saving for. My little girl was getting married. That joy, however, was quickly consumed by the sheer scale of their expectations. A week later, they sat on my sofa, the same sofa where Clara had once curled up to watch cartoons, and presented me with what they called their vision board. It wasn't a board so much as a thick binder filled with glossy photos, spreadsheets, and contracts awaiting a signature. It was a corporate prospectus for a royal wedding. A historic 5-star hotel downtown was the non-negotiable venue. A celebrity wedding planner, a woman with her own television show, was required to execute their vision. The guest list was already approaching 300 people, most of whom were Julian's family's business associates and social connections. It was not a conversation, it was a briefing. With a deep breath and a swell of pride, I told them about the fund. "Clara, honey," I began, my voice thick with emotion, "your father and I always wanted to give you a beautiful wedding. We saved for it for years. I have $200,000 set aside for you." I expected tears, gratitude, a hug. Instead, Julian smiled a tight, patronizing smile and exchanged a look with Clara. "Well, Helen," he said, his tone that of a CEO addressing a junior intern, "that's a wonderful start. A very generous gesture, a start. A gesture." Clara then opened the binder to the budget page. My eyes scanned the columns of figures, my bookkeeper's mind reeling. The venue rental and catering minimum was $150,000. The planner's fee was $30,000. The flowers were budgeted at $25,000. Photography and videography, $40,000. The band, another $20,000. The total was already cresting $300,000, and that didn't include the dress, the invitations, the rehearsal dinner, or the myriad other costs I could see lurking in the fine print. I felt the air leave my lungs. This is more than I have," I said, my voice a small, bewildered thing. Julian leaned forward, his expression one of patient condescension. "Helen, a wedding like this isn't an expense. It's an investment. It's the foundational event for our social and professional lives. The people we invite, the impression we make, it pays dividends for years. We assumed the $200,000 was your contribution to the cause." The word contribution hung in the air, clinical and cold. My life savings with Robert, our final act of love for our daughter, was now a line item, a down payment on their social ambitions. Clara, seeing the shock on my face, reached out and patted my hand. "Mum, it's what Dad would have wanted," she said softly. "For me to have the best. We'll be so grateful." They used my promise to Robert as a lever, and I let them. That day, I wrote the first check. A $50,000 non-refundable deposit for the hotel. My hand trembled as I signed my name. It felt less like a gift and more like a ransom. The months that followed were a masterclass in slow, painful erasure. My role was clarified early on. I was the financier, not a participant. My involvement was welcome only when it came to approving a payment or signing a check. When I tried to offer an opinion, I was met with a gentle but firm wall of dismissal. I remember the meeting with the florist, a chic young woman who spoke of floral installations and tablescapes when she presented a plan that involved flying in orchids from Hawaii at a cost that could have funded my own wedding 10 times over. I timidly suggested using seasonal, local flowers, like the beautiful roses from the public garden in my town. Julian had laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Helen, that's a lovely thought for a garden party, but it's not quite the aesthetic we are cultivating." Clara had nodded in agreement. "Julian's right, Mum. It would look cheap. My suggestions were cheap. My taste was cheap. By extension, I was cheap." The message was clear. I was the dowdy, provincial mother with the checkbook, a necessary, but slightly embarrassing component of their grand production. The introduction to Julian's parents, the Montgomerys, solidified my status. We met for brunch at their country club, an imposing institution of old money and new arrogance. Richard Montgomery spoke only of markets and mergers, occasionally glancing at me as if trying to calculate my net worth and finding it wanting. His wife, Eleanor, was a specimen of icy perfection. She appraised my sensible dress and modest jewelry with a cool, sweeping gaze that made me feel like I had forgotten to take off my apron. She spoke at length about their upcoming trip to Monaco for the Grand Prix and the challenges of finding good help for their summer home in the Hamptons. They asked me what I did, and when I told them I was a retired bookkeeper, Eleanor smiled faintly. "How wonderful," she said, her tone dripping with insincerity. To have such a simple profession. The ultimate humiliation came during the search for the wedding dress. We went to a boutique in the city where the gowns were kept in glass cases like museum artifacts. Clara tried on a dress by a French designer, a confection of lace and silk that cost more than my car. It was beautiful, I couldn't deny it, but the price tag, $40,000, was staggering. "Honey," I whispered to Clara in the dressing room, "it's exquisite, but there's another one you tried on, the lace one, that was just as lovely and a quarter of the price." Clara's face hardened. "You just don't get it, do you, Mum? This is a statement piece. It's the dress. Are you really going to nickel and dime me on my wedding dress?" Julian, who had been waiting outside, stepped into the doorway. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his eyes flicking from my face to Clara's. "Your mother was just questioning the cost," Clara said, her voice trembling with manufactured drama. Julian looked at me, his jaw tight. "Helen," he said, his voice dangerously low, "Clara gets the dress she wants. The cost is not a factor for discussion. It's an investment in her happiness and our image. We will not have our wedding day compromised by budgetary constraints." The threat was implicit. I was a constraint. My prudence was a problem to be managed. I felt my cheeks burn with a shame so hot it brought tears to my eyes. I nodded mutely and walked to the front desk to arrange the payment. Later that week, I took out the small, velvet-lined box that held the pearls Robert had given me on our wedding day. They weren't extravagant, but they were classic, lustrous, and filled with a history of love. I offered them to Clara, thinking they could be her something old. She held them in her palm for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "They are lovely, Mum, really," she said, her voice soft but distant. "But Julian is having a set custom-made for me at Tiffany's. They'll better match the aesthetic of the gown." I took the box back, the velvet suddenly feeling cold and worn. I closed the lid, and with it, I felt another door in my heart click shut. I was not just being dismissed. I was being replaced, my history and my love deemed incompatible with their shiny, new, expensive future. The rehearsal dinner was the culmination of all the small slights, the final, brutal severance. It was held at a Michelin-starred restaurant where the plates were large and the portions were small, a place designed to intimidate more than to nourish. The event was hosted and paid for by the Montgomerys, a fact Eleanor made sure to mention several times. I sat at a table near the back, feeling like a foreign dignitary from a small, insignificant country, smiled at politely but largely ignored. The room was filled with the loud, confident laughter of Julian's world. Men in bespoke suits and women dripping with diamonds. I saw my daughter across the room, floating between conversations, looking radiant and utterly at home. She caught my eye once, gave a small, fleeting wave, and then turned back to her new life. The toasts began. Julian's father, Richard, stood and gave a long, rambling speech about mergers and acquisitions, somehow comparing Julian's marriage to Clara to a successful corporate takeover, a strategic move to secure future assets. He called Clara a stunning addition to the Montgomery portfolio. I felt a wave of nausea. Then, Julian stood, holding his champagne flute. The room fell silent. He looked dashing in his tailored suit, the picture of success. He began by thanking his parents effusively for their guidance, their support, and, he added with a smirk, their generous seed funding for his various ventures. He thanked his friends for being his board of directors, then he turned his gaze to Clara. "To my beautiful bride," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "You have made me the happiest man in the world." He then paused, and his eyes swept the room. I must also give a brief nod to Clara's late father, whose legacy has contributed to making this all possible, a brief nod. Robert's life of hard work, our shared dreams, reduced to a footnote, a legacy to be liquidated for their party. But the final blow was yet to come. Julian raised his glass higher. I am so thrilled to be joining the Montgomery family. And Clara will be a Montgomery. We are surrounded tonight by our true family, the people who will form the bedrock of our new life together. As he said the words true family, he made a sweeping gesture that encompassed his parents, his relatives, his glossy friends, everyone on his side of the room. My side was empty, save for me. The exclusion was not an oversight, it was a declaration. It was deliberate, public, and absolute. I was not family. I was the hired help, the sponsor, the embarrassing old relic whose function had been served. The air in my lungs turned to ice. Every head in the room seemed to turn toward me, some with pity, most with indifference. I looked at Clara. Our eyes met for a bare, shattering second. I saw a flicker of something, guilt. Panic, before she dropped her gaze to her plate, her shoulders hunching slightly. She didn't speak. She didn't object. She didn't look at me again. In her silence, I heard my own verdict. I was obsolete. The warmth of the room, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, it all faded into a dull, roaring sound in my ears. The humiliation was a physical thing, a heavy cloak that settled on my shoulders, suffocating me. I sat there for another minute, my heart hammering against my ribs, a cold, hard knot forming in my stomach. Then, with a calmness that surprised even me, I quietly pushed back my chair, picked up my purse, and walked out of the restaurant without a word to anyone. The cold night air hit my face like a slap, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The drive home was a blur. The familiar streets of my city seemed alien, the traffic lights bleeding into long streaks of red and green through my tear-filled eyes. I drove on autopilot, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The radio was off, but my mind was deafeningly loud, replaying Julian's words over and over. Our true family, the phrase was a branding iron, searing itself into my consciousness. Each time I heard it in my head, it was followed by the image of Clara's face, her quick, averted gaze, her silent complicity. That was the wound that cut deeper than Julian's arrogance. His cruelty I could almost understand. He was a stranger, a man whose values were antithetical to my own. But Clara, my Clara. Her silence was a betrayal that eclipsed everything else. It was an active choice, a decision to stand with him and his world, and to leave me on the other side of the velvet rope. The grief I felt was immense, a physical ache in my chest. But as the miles passed, something else began to bubble up through the sorrow, a white-hot, cleansing rage. It started as a small spark in the pit of my stomach and grew with every memory that surfaced. I remembered patching her scraped knees. I remembered staying up all night with her when she had the flu. I remembered the pride that swelled in my chest at her university graduation, a pride so big I thought I would burst. I remembered the quiet, solemn promise I made to Robert. And that's when the rage crystallized into something hard and clear as diamond. Robert. Would he have wanted this? Would my practical, no-nonsense husband, who despised pretension and valued integrity above all else, want his life's work to be used as a slush fund to finance my public humiliation? Would he want his daughter to marry a man who dismissed his memory with a brief nod? Would he want his wife to be treated as a walking, talking ATM, discarded once her account was drained? The answer echoed in the silent car with the force of a thunderclap. No. Absolutely not. My promise to him wasn't just to provide for Clara, it was to protect her, to guide her. And it was also to protect what we had built together, our legacy of love and hard work and dignity. By allowing this to happen, I wasn't honoring Robert. I was desecrating his memory. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the tears had stopped. My sorrow had burned away, leaving behind a cold, resolute calm. I walked into the house, the silence no longer feeling oppressive but purposeful. I went straight to the small oak desk in the study, the one Robert had built for me. I sat in the chair where I had managed our finances for 40 years, and I pulled out the wedding ledger. I turned on the desk lamp, and in its warm, focused glow, I looked at the columns of figures. The $50,000 deposit for the hotel. The $30,000 fee for the planner. The $40,000 payment for the dress. The thousands more for caterer deposits, stationery, and other sundries. I had already spent over $120,000 of the fund. But there were still significant payments outstanding. The final balance for the venue. The full amount for the caterer. The bill for the Hawaiian orchids and the 10-piece band. It all came due tomorrow. On the wedding day. For a moment, I pictured the chaos, the embarrassment for Clara. A pang of my old maternal instinct twisted in my gut. But then I pictured her face at the restaurant, her silent betrayal. And I knew what I had to do. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. It was about reclaiming my money, my dignity, and the memory of the man I loved. My promise to Robert was not a suicide pact. My duty as a mother did not require me to be a doormat. I opened a fresh page in the ledger. At the top, I wrote, reclamation, and I began to make a new set of calculations. I woke the next morning before the sun, feeling more rested than I had in months. The agonizing indecision was gone, replaced by a profound and chilling clarity. Today was the day of the wedding. For Clara and Julian, it was meant to be the start of their grand new life. For me, it was the day I took mine back. I made myself a cup of strong, black coffee, and sat at the oak desk as the first grey light of dawn filtered through the window. I had my list. My plan. I was no longer a grieving widow, or a doting mother. I was the financier, and I was about to pull the plug. My first call was to the wedding planner, the imperious woman who spoke of aesthetics. I dialed her private cell number, which I had been given for emergencies only disqualified. She answered on the second ring, her voice a clipped, professional purr. Antonia here, Antonia, I said, my voice even and steady, devoid of any emotion. This is Helen Croft, Clara's mother Helen. Good morning. Is everything all right? The bride is getting her hair and makeup done. As we speak, everything is fine on my end, I replied calmly. I am calling to inform you of a change in the financial arrangements for today's event. I am the sole financier of this wedding, as you know from the checks you've been cashing. Effective immediately, all further funding from me has been terminated. I will not be making any more payments. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her sharp intake of breath. I don't understand, she stammered. Is this a joke? I have never been more serious in my life, I said, my voice as cold as ice. I have already paid over $120,000 in non-refundable deposits and fees. That is my final contribution. The remaining balance for the venue, the caterer, the florist, the band, and your own final invoice, which I calculate to be in excess of $100,000, are now the full responsibility of Julian and Clara Montgomery. You should take it up with them, but the contracts. The venue needs the final payment in 2 hours, or they won't open the ballroom. The caterer won't unload the trucks. Her professional purr had escalated into a panicked squawk. That sounds like a problem for your clients, I said. My business with you is concluded. I hung up before she could respond. My next call was to my financial advisor. I instructed him to immediately wire the remaining $80,000 from the wedding fund into a new trust account, one that was irrevocable, and in my name only. He, bless his professional discretion, asked no questions and executed the order immediately. The money was safe. My final act was to compose a text message. I thought for a long time about what to say, what final words to leave them with. In the end, I realized that very few were needed. I typed it out, my fingers moving precisely over the screen. Julian was correct last night. You are surrounded by your true family. They can pay for the rest of the wedding. I have cancelled all further payments. This is not a discussion. Do not contact me. I read it over once, then hit send. Then, I did something I hadn't done in years. I powered my phone off completely. I held the silent, dark rectangle in my hand for a moment. I imagined the frantic calls that would now go unanswered. The cascading chaos at the hotel. Clara, in her $40,000 dress, discovering that her fairy tale had just been foreclosed on. Julian, the master of the universe, being confronted with invoices he actually had to pay himself. A small, grim smile touched my lips. I placed the dead phone on the desk, a small black tombstone for the life I was leaving behind. I walked into my kitchen and put the kettle on again. The silence in the house was no longer a monument to pain. It was the sound of freedom. I knew my home would be the first place they would look, a fortress they would undoubtedly try to breach. The thought of a confrontation, of Clara's tears and Julian's rage, filled me with a weariness I couldn't bear. My battle was won. I had no interest in surveying the battlefield. So, I packed a small overnight bag with a few essentials and the book I was currently reading. Then I made one more call, this time on my old landline. My friend, Margaret, answered on the first ring. Margaret and I had been friends for 50 years. She had known Robert, had held Clara as a baby, and had watched the last 2 years unfold with a quiet, knowing disapproval she was too polite to voice unless asked. Helen, she said, her voice warm and familiar. Is everything okay? It's early. I'm fine, Marg, I said, and to my surprise, my voice was steady. In fact, I think I'm better than fine. But I need to ask a huge favor. Can I come and stay with you for a few days? Of course you can. Is it Clara? The wedding, she asked, her tone shifting with concern. And so, I told her. I told her everything. The escalating demands, the dismissal, the humiliation of the rehearsal dinner. And then I told her what I had done that morning. I laid it all out, the cold, hard facts of my financial rebellion. When I finished, there was a moment of silence on the line, and for a heart-stopping second, I feared her judgment. Then, I heard her let out a long, slow whistle. Well, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. It's about damn time, Helen Croft. I'm so proud of you. I could burst. The validation was so pure, so absolute, it felt like a dam breaking inside me. I finally let out the breath I felt like I'd been holding for 2 years. An hour later, I was sitting in Margaret's cozy sunroom, a steaming mug of her best tea in my hands. Her small cottage was a world away from the cold grandeur of the Montgomerys, filled with books and plants and the smell of baking bread. It was a sanctuary. We spent the day talking, not just about the wedding, but about everything. About Robert, about our younger years, about our hopes for the future. For the first time, I allowed myself to speak the resentments I had swallowed for so long, and Margaret just listened, nodding, her presence a comforting, solid reassurance. That evening, against my better judgment, I logged into my email on her computer. There was only one message from Clara, sent from her phone in the late afternoon. The subject line was just my name, in all capital letters. The message itself was a torrent of incoherent rage and disbelief. It accused me of being selfish, cruel, and vindictive. It said I had ruined her life, that I had publicly humiliated her and Julian for no reason. It was filled with exclamation points and furious, misspelled words. It ended with, "How could you do this to your own daughter?" I read the message twice. There was no apology. No acknowledgement of my pain. No recognition of the provocation. Her only concern was for her ruined party and her public image. I stared at her question. How could you do this to your own daughter? The real question, the one she would never ask, was how could you have done that to your own mother? With a click of the mouse, I moved the email to the trash folder and then emptied it. I felt nothing. No guilt, no regret. Just a profound, quiet emptiness where my maternal obligation used to be. I was free. Weeks turned into a month. I stayed with Margaret for a little while longer, letting the dust settle, allowing myself the time and space to heal without the threat of confrontation. I learned through the grapevine, a friend of Margaret's whose cousin was a caterer, that the wedding had, in fact, been cancelled at the last minute. The Montgomerys, for all their talk of wealth, had apparently refused to cover the outstanding $100,000 bill on such short notice. The resulting scene at the hotel had been epic in its chaotic fallout. Clara and Julian had retreated in disgrace. I felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a kind of detached, sociological interest. They had built their entire world on a foundation of image and status, and I had simply pulled out the cornerstone. The entire structure had collapsed, just as I knew it would. When I finally returned to my house, it felt different. The silence was no longer a monument, or a liberation, it was simply a quiet space waiting to be filled with something new. But the memories were thick in the air, ghosts of a life that no longer fit me. Robert's armchair, the kitchen where I'd baked countless birthday cakes for Clara, the garden where she had played. It was a house built for a family, and my family, as I had known it, was gone. So, I made another decision, one that was just for me. I called a real estate agent. I sold the big family home, the one Robert had built, and I didn't look back with sadness. I knew its value was not in the wood and nails, but in the love it had contained for so many years. That love was now a part of my history, not my future. With the proceeds from the sale and the reclaimed wedding fund, I was, for the first time in my life, truly independent and unburdened. I bought a beautiful, light-filled two-bedroom condominium overlooking the ocean, an hour's drive down the coast. It was modern and clean, a blank canvas. I filled it not with old memories, but with new furniture, new art, and new possibilities. And then I did what Robert and I had always talked about but never done. I booked a trip. I went on a cruise to Alaska, standing on the deck wrapped in a warm coat, watching glacier carve into the turquoise water. I traveled to Italy and sat in a sun-drenched piazza in Florence, sipping a glass of Chianti and feeling the centuries of art and history settle into my bones. I rediscovered Helen. Not Helen the wife, not Helen the mother, not Helen the bookkeeper. Just Helen. A woman with her own thoughts, her own desires, her own future. I joined a book club in my new building. I started taking watercolor painting classes. I met a gentleman named Arthur, a witty, kind widower who taught history at the local college. We had coffee, then lunch, then dinner. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, but a gentle, respectful companionship that was as comforting as a warm fire on a cool evening. One evening, I was sitting on my new balcony, the sound of the waves a gentle rhythm below. I was watching the sunset paint the sky in strokes of orange and purple, a glass of crisp white wine in my hand. My new phone, a simple smartphone Arthur had helped me set up, began to ring. The screen displayed an unknown number, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my gut, who it was. It was Clara. It was the first attempt at contact since that single, hate-filled email. I watched the screen, saw her name in my mind's eye. I thought of the little girl I had loved so fiercely, the daughter I had mourned. Then I thought of the woman who had stood by silently and watched my heart break. I let it ring, the sound an intrusion on my perfect peace. It rang and rang, a desperate, unanswered plea from a world I no longer inhabited. Finally, it stopped. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I took a slow sip of my wine, the cool liquid a perfect counterpoint to the warmth of the fading sun on my skin. The resentment was gone. The anger was gone. In their place was a vast, calm, and shimmering peace. A peace I had earned. A peace that was all my own. The future stretched out before me, as wide and as beautiful as the ocean at my feet.